This is a podcast brought to you by the Iclif Executive Education Centre at the Asia School of Business, Kuala Lumpur. With us today is Professor Mark Yuen, Professor of Accounting at NUS Business School, National University of Singapore, and Adjunct Faculty at the Asia School of Business. Professor Mark, who needs no further introduction to our capital market, has recently published a report on integrating ESG factors into executive remuneration. The report was published in collaboration with Sustainable Finance Institute Asia and CPA Australia. Welcome, Prof. Mark.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you some questions on that report. It's available on your website.
Yes, and on CPA Australia website and SFIA's website.
Okay, so our listeners can actually access it. But here's some of the questions I have based on the report. Because of late, we find that regulators have been asking companies to improve their ESG practices and disclosures, especially in relation to climate change. And in some instances, this is going to require quite high capital expenditure, which will affect the dividend payout, so to speak, for investors. So, how actually can companies balance this out? How do boards especially balance investors' expectations against, and also incentivize senior management? Because senior management usually incentivize on financial performance, and the outcome of this capital expenditure may take some time to show that impact.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of things there. I think first is, of course, the shareholder and stakeholder engagement is very important. I mean, communicating to investors in terms of how you are addressing ESG and educating investors that some of those may not immediately translate into short-term financial performance. In fact, I often think that, often we look at questions like diversity and other ESG issues. We kind of try to look at linkages to immediate financial performance. I think that's the wrong way to look at them. And because some of them will only translate to financial performance in the long term. So in terms of what remuneration committees and companies then I think need to do, one is possibly to start thinking about having more long-term incentives. I think there's still this Asia practice. Many companies, many of their remuneration policies is still weighted very much towards annual salary and annual bonus. There's very little long-term incentives. And if these factors are going to translate into long-term value, then it makes sense to use more long-term incentives. That's one. I think there are other things that boards and remuneration can do, which is to say, okay, there is going to be some kind of cost, as you mentioned, right? If you invest in trying to pivot towards renewables, for example, you will have to incur capital expenditure. I think that's where boards and remuneration committees have to say, do we need to now look at what is a better measure of the performance in terms of financials? We talk about EBITDA, for example, right? If you have capital expenditure and you use EBITDA, of course, capital expenditure will be amortized. And if you use EBITDA rather than using net profit, in a way, that will shield management a bit from the fact that you have to incur expenditure and you have to amortize it or depreciate it over a number of years. But there may also be expenditure that you have to write off immediately. Okay, let's say you want to put in better health and safety policies for your staff, or improve equity within the company. That may require immediate expenditure, operating expenditure that you can't even capitalize. I think that's where boards and remuneration committee needs to say, okay, we're going to now use some other indicators rather than just financials in the balance scorecard for the CEO. And maybe we now need to look at what kind of profit measure should we use. Should we filter out certain things when you are looking at the performance to recognize that there is going to be some short-term impact on bottom line? So I think there are a number of things, and then having to communicate that to investors. This is our plan, and maybe there will be a short-term financial cost.
Thank you. That's really useful. I'm sure the boards and remuneration committees are going to go back to the drawing board. Now, My second question is about how, we are going to assess the impact of performance metrics on the financial performance of the company. Yeah? Because under the social category, earlier you mentioned diversity. I mean, how do you look at the immediate impact? So under the social category of ESG, it's quite difficult to measure it in terms of the financial performance of the company. For example, staff retention or attrition rates. That's an example. So how do you think companies should deal with this without being seen as setting soft targets? Because I may say that my retention rate is 96%, but the reasons that I retain these people and the impact on the financial performance, it's not clear. The link is not clear.
Yeah, I always say that financial performance is kind of lagging indicators. A lot of this staff turnover, retention things are kind of leading indicators. So when you have problems with retention, especially retention of your critical staff and your high performers, it may only translate into poorer financial performance some way down the track. That's why it's quite important. I think even before we talk about ESG, I mean, many companies do recognize you need to use a balanced scorecard. You have to look at other kinds of non-financial indicators. But I think that's where remuneration committees need to have, and boards need to have conversation like, let's say talent management, right? The point that you mentioned. They should be thinking, if talent management is an important factor from an S point of view, what are useful indicators for talent management? To me, staff turnover is something that should always be monitored by companies, and they should always look at voluntary versus involuntary turnover. They should look at by different sectors of the business. There's one company I'm aware of where if you look at the sustainability report, you have to read through the whole report, and then you see within a page where they have Australian operations and they have Singapore operations. And if you look at the voluntary and involuntary turnover in the Australian operations is much higher than the whole overall group. That should raise some questions. If I'm sitting on the board and remuneration committee, I would be asking, right, what is the cost for this? But I think talent management, of course, is also about retaining your critical staff and your high Ps, right? So it's not just overall staff turnover maybe tells you something about, it could tell you things like, is there something with our recruitment policies? Is there pay equity issues? Is there management style issues, culture issues? So they could be important indicators. But when you think about talent management, then you may need to be more granular and kind of say, okay, now we also need to look at our retention and turnover for our high performers and our critical staff. And you need to have conversation, okay, who are the most critical staff in your company and who are the high performers in your company? Okay,
thanks for that. Can you talk us through the different methods to incorporate ESG factors in incentive plans? You've talked about that in your report, but perhaps you could describe it to listeners.
Yeah, there's certainly a number of questions that need to be asked. But in terms of how, let's say you have got past and identified the material ESG factors and what metrics to use, then the next question is, how do you incorporate them? So basically, you could do it in a number of ways. One is you do it using specific metrics, like using what they sometimes call a KPI approach. So you set either a number of specific metrics, so safety and environment, for example, right? So you look at indicators for that and you weight them specifically. So that's sometimes called standalone metrics, right? So you could say for the annual bonus, 30% or 20% is based on these two factors. But more commonly, what companies do today is to have what is called a ESG scorecard. So rather than just having that one or two factors. And the one or two factors could be useful for companies where clearly there are one or two important metrics that essentially could destroy your business or really seriously harm your reputation. But other than that, many other companies, maybe an ESG scorecard works better in that you have an ESG scorecard that captures the different elements of ESG, and then you say overall, maybe the ESG scorecard is worth 30%, and the financial performance criteria are worth 70%, or whatever. That's the second approach. And then third approach, you have just an overall scorecard, rather than a specific ESG scorecard, right? So those are the different ways where you can specifically build ESG into your bonus formula, for example. But what some companies do is they use what is called modifier approach, which is that, so those companies may say, we want to leave our bonus formula intact at the moment. We're not going to disturb that. Maybe we are not quite ready to disturb that. But what they do is then have some general ESG KPIs. They say if the CEO or CFO, senior management, meets certain ESG criteria, they will get what is called modifier to the bonus. They get 10% more or 10% less. Okay, so that's the other approach. And then the third approach is if a company has some very critical factors, like, you may actually specify if certain critical events happen, you don't even get a bonus. And those will be, maybe you have a whole building structure collapse and a lot of people die, right? Very critical event. Probably in that situation, you say nobody gets a bonus, right? So that's one thing. Then the next thing you got to ask, should I just build that into the annual bonus, the short-term incentive? Or should I build that into the long-term incentives too? I think it's important going forward for companies to not only build it into the short-term incentives, they should build it into the long-term incentives.
Okay, yeah. That's very useful. Your report, it refers to weighting ESG metrics between 5 to 25%, and you've actually suggested starting at 5% and then working their way up. But, for the Malaysian capital market, it's been at least, 6 years minimum since they've started reporting on their disclosures, sustainability disclosures. And they would have had to weigh their, look at their materiality, what are material sustainable matters, report and targets and things like that. Don't you think that in light of the length of time, the leeway that we've had, that remuneration committees should actually start off with a high weighting of ESG matters?
Yeah, it is true. I mean, Malaysia, like many markets, have sustainability reporting for a number of years now. But, when sustainability reporting started, I always felt it's kind of separated from, it's not integrated within the company. In the sense it's almost like the end of the year, we get a consultant or we get somebody to just prepare a sustainability report. And then we look at whatever framework and we tick the boxes against those framework, right? And to me, going from that to food, that's why in the report we call it integrating, because it's not a simple question of just taking whatever, just because there have been sustainability reporting, that you can just then jump from there to say, okay, we can now just jump straight into and put 30% into the remuneration. Because there's still, in the report we talk about the 10 questions, right, that remuneration committee needs to ask. There's still the question, in terms of remuneration, what are the right indicators? Now, you may report it at the entity level, but from a CEO, CFO, or senior management level, what are the right indicators to use? And so on, right? So there are all those things that you need to go through. So I don't think it's such a simple step. I wouldn't, I say kind of stuff on low end. I mean, it could be 5-10%, but it really depends on your company. There may be companies which are ready to put a bit more weighting. And the other reason why I said that is, if you look at a report, we look at ASEAN practices. So we look at 135 ASEAN companies which were in the ASEAN scorecard. They are supposed to be the better governed companies. We found like 21, 22 companies that essentially now say they link it, but most of them are very vague. They don't say how they do it. And I went to an AGM, I actually asked a company, because the company claims that they link ESG to remuneration. So I specifically asked them, now tell me how you do it. And it was like, oh, well, we haven't really quite do it. We're still figuring it out. So until you are ready to explain to investors how exactly you are measuring that, I'm not sure you want to go 30% now, because investors will then be very skeptical about it. So I think putting in place, maybe going through that 10 questions, getting enough, substance to those. How are you using quantitative, qualitative? What are the right metrics to use? What weighting and so on? What are appropriate? Should I build into long-term, short-term incentives and so on? So going through that, and then when you're ready, then do it seriously. Otherwise, if you say 40%, everybody will say you are very soft if you can't be specific in terms of how you're doing it. Yeah.
I think that would be helpful for remuneration committees to use as a guide.
Yeah.
Okay, one final question before we let you go, right? So ESG targets can be measured against internal targets or external benchmarks. And, in the case of the latter, there's quite a confusing array of guidelines and rating agencies with different requirements and weightage. I think that's something that we hear a lot from remuneration committees and boards. So where internal targets are concerned, I think your report actually mentions that companies could set the targets too low in order to be able to report that they've achieved all of the targets. So do you have any advice on which is the better practice for companies to follow from the point of view of the Remuneration Committee, as well as from the point of view of investors? You've just explained you as an investor asked certain questions and the company couldn't answer.
Yeah, I think those external ESG ratings or those external standards are still important because investors are using them, right? For better or worse, they are still using them. And we see inconsistencies, right? We see companies that are AAA in one rating and then high risk on another rating. Okay, so I think it can be used as kind of like I think if you are remuneration committee on the board, you want to make sure that you are still performing reasonably against the different ratings. And I think one thing you need to watch out for when you use external ratings is there's no cherry picking of those external ratings, So you want to look for consistency across the different ratings. But I wouldn't use that to drive the remuneration. I think it's a bit dangerous because every company has its own context, and a lot of these external ratings are based on disclosures, So I would say that the internal ones are still better, and because it's tailored to your specific context. But of course, you then that's where the transparency, the communication becomes important. You must be prepared to explain how you actually assess performance. How do you set the targets? For example, just now we talked about staff turnover, right? I mean, are you willing to disclose what was the previous staff turnover, historical staff turnover, and be able to demonstrate that in fact has been improvements around those? And the other thing is, I think when it's internal, it's important not to set things that are just very easy to achieve. It shouldn't be just a matter of do you have management put in a policy, because that's hardly going to matter. So you want to look for outcomes type of measures. So I've given examples in the report, right, where, Starbucks, right? I mean, they say for the CEO, one of the metric was eliminate use of plastic straws. I say, well, the CEO can make that decision. Tomorrow I just pass edict to all the Starbucks stores. Stop using plastic straws. That's easy for the CEO to achieve. Or if I want to have, we talk about gender diversity, right? To appoint 10% of women. If it's just something like that, that's something, to me, it can be done. The CEO can just decide to do that. I think what you want is really meaningful indicators of, things that clearly you see, you are willing to show historically what that is. And then that there has actually been significant improvement around that. Yeah. So I overall, I still think that internal targets are probably better, but some companies can choose. So there are companies that choose a mix of internal and external. That could also be useful.
Yeah, that might be very useful actually to do. Okay, unfortunately, we are running out of time. So thank you so much for being here today. And we really hope to have you back on another podcast on another topic that you published.
My pleasure. Most welcome.
Okay. To all our listeners, this is Professor Mak Yuen Tin, Professor of Accounting at NUS Business School, National University of Singapore, and also adjunct faculty at the Asia School of Business.